So we're here in New Bond Street in London, in the West End of London. This is a statue unveiled in 1995 called The Allies, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt. But for me, almost the most significant thing about it is who's not here, which is of course the third great ally, Joseph Stalin. And why isn't he here? Well, we can only speculate. But my guess is he's not here because he's inconvenient in terms of the history as it is seen now, in popular terms. And in the popular consciousness, the war's about the alliance, great alliance between Britain and America. And as a result of the Cold War and everything else that happened at the end of the war, Stalin became a very inconvenient figure. I've met an awful lot more people who knew and worked with Hitler than knew and worked with Stalin. And that's because Stalin was much more likely to kill you if you worked with him. Now, Hitler was actually, in his own terms, loyal to the core group of people he started in the Nazi Party with, people like Himmler and Goering and Goebbels and Hess and Bormann and so on. Stalin's got a very different relationship with these other people in the Politburo and his close colleagues. Virtually none of them emerge unscathed from this. And so you have this sense of enormous personal anxiety and concern being with Stalin. And I think he wanted to create that. One of the things I'm so pleased about with the performance of Stalin in the series, and I think it may be a surprise to people, is that Stalin doesn't lose his temper that much. He's, for the most part, a very calm, kind of watchful person, and watchfulness is a key thing with him. It's very different from Hitler. He's watching people, and he's constantly, overwhelmingly suspicious. He really fascinates me. I mean, I've got terribly into the way he would use calculated insults to throw people off guard. See, the key thing I think to him was he never wanted to be liked. Roger Ailes, the great political consultant in America, described the key quality needed for electability in America as likability. If you have no likability, you can't succeed on TV, you can't succeed in the democratic world. Likability. Stalin didn't have a lot of likability. Propaganda pictured him as one thing, which is another issue, but if you're dealing with him, you're not concerned about likability. He's absolutely ideologically motivated in the sense of believing genuinely in Marxist-Leninism. He believes that he should live relatively simply. You know, he at one point, I think, has his new furniture taken back. He said he wants old furniture. I love that the description of his office from Lord Allenbrook, who went there and he came back and he said it's like a second-class railway waiting room. You know, it's not. There was absolute ideology there. I mean, he's not a monster who's out like, as sometimes it's something like Saddam Hussein or something. He's absolutely ideologically rooted. And I think he believes that the individuals he's dealing with are unimportant as individuals. And so Stalin called in one of his top oil engineers, Baibakov, and said to him, I want you to ensure that Hitler does not take these oil fields. And you should do that by blowing them up if they're about to take them, and obviously not blowing them up if he doesn't take them. But if they take them and you haven't blown them up, we'll kill you. And if you blow them up and they don't take them, we'll also kill you. And this guy, Baibakov, the engineer who this happened to, who I met and we interviewed, and he's died since, he was one of the very last people left alive who had this sort of experience with Stalin. What's really fascinating about it is that, from his perspective, Stalin did the right thing. And he wasn't remotely upset that Stalin had done this. It was like I was personally, you know, and he liked dealing with Stalin. He thought Stalin was an extremely impressive man and good man to work for. You know, there's a later scene in episode, I think it's 5, where Stalin, in a banquet held in honor of de Gaulle in the Kremlin, calls up various people, including this guy Marshal Novikov, who's his guys in charge of the Red Army Air Force, and says, give you a toast, Marshal, for the great Air Force you're creating. And he turns to de Gaulle and says, but he should know that if he does anything wrong, we'll kill him. And then he goes, cheers. And everyone's just, you know, and then I think 2 years after that, Novikov's arrested, brutally interrogated, made to write a false confession. He then serves years and years and years in jail. So it's not a joke. I mean, he presents it as a joke, but it's not a joke. Even with Churchill, it's not quite as straightforward as it might appear, because what's going on an awful lot with Churchill, I think we see, you certainly see this in the book, where I'm able to go into much more detail about this than in the series, but he's much less consistent in his view than you might imagine. What's so interesting to me is how he shifts his view on the Soviet Union, and shifts it one way, then shifts it back again, and then shifts it another way. And you see that with this issue about whether he's prepared to let Stalin keep Eastern Poland, the territory that Stalin had negotiated with the Nazis in September 1939 that he could get. The British are shocked. Eden is shocked. Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, is shocked when he goes to Moscow in December 1941, that the first thing Stalin raises in the meeting is the question, let's be clear, I want all that territory back at the end of the war. And Churchill, when Eden writes to him and says, you should know how important this is to Stalin, maybe, it's not exactly within the Atlantic Charter, this moral guide we have as how we should run the war, but, how can we have a relationship with Stalin if we don't give it to him? Churchill writes back this incredible note full of sort of tub-thumping morality about this territory was gained in shameful collusion with the Nazis, never could a government have mined, all this. And you think, my goodness, the morals. And yet, 2 years later, he's in with persuading the Polish government in exile that they would be idiots not to do this very same thing, not to give it to him. Well, maybe one's naive, but if it's morally not acceptable to do this in January 1942, why is it morally acceptable to do it in October 1944? And the answer is things change. But so even Churchill he's not operating at a level of consistency that the popular myth gives you. But the more you look at it all, there's a whole load of revisionist work on Churchill which says, oh no, he's got all these terrible faults and so on. Absolutely surely the case that if it hadn't been for that one individual in May 1940, Britain was in serious danger of ceasing to exist. Churchill could be very brusque and non-kind of charming to people he thought were not important. Roosevelt, on the contrary, could be incredibly charming to people he wasn't thought important. He had this wonder, this incredible grand seigneur-ness that, in a way, Churchill was much more emotionally up and down. I think that Roosevelt was absolutely on this steady keel all the time. The way he ran things was so politically adept and sophisticated. One tiny thing, one of these people who had problems with him said to me that their dealings with him were that whenever they wrote him a letter that he agreed with, they get a reply the next day. Whenever he wrote a letter they disagreed with, he never replied. And it's really interesting. Churchill wrote these vast volumes about the war. Any number of people have talked about Churchill. Moran kept a diary of Churchill and so on. So we've got, I think, a pretty good understanding of what's going on with Churchill. Stalin, in many ways, because of the nature of the meetings and so on, he seems to have a coherent view. Roosevelt never kept a diary, never wrote a book about himself. He constantly made it so that he famously said, I never let my right hand know what my left hand's doing. He would have people over here doing this, and without them knowing it, he'd have people over there doing this. And only he, like a spider in the middle of a web, kept everything together. He used to bypass the State Department, their Foreign Office. So that one of his aides, George Elsie, told me how the State Department were reduced to going to the British Foreign Office to ask what he said, because they thought that he'd have to have told the Foreign Office. So Roosevelt as an individual is absolutely fascinating. Roosevelt at the Tehran conference in November 1943 makes a deliberate decision not to support Churchill, to tease him in front of Stalin, to build a relationship with Stalin. Roosevelt's envoy to Stalin in 1943 is trying to arrange a secret meeting between Roosevelt and Stalin without letting Churchill know. And then when Churchill finds out about the secret meeting, Churchill complains, and Roosevelt said, oh, the secret meeting wasn't my idea, it was Stalin's, I had nothing to do with that. Well, this isn't kind of this rosy sense of the propaganda that about the relationship that we've been led to believe. You cannot begin to understand Russia today without understanding its wartime experience and its reaction to that wartime experience. And again, one of the things that I knew a bit about before starting on this, but had not understood the massive importance of, was this issue, quite simply, of when D-Day was going to be. When the Soviets were in horrific trouble in the spring, summer of 1942, Molotov goes on an extraordinary journey, first to London, but then to Washington. And he goes with one aim, which is to say to Churchill and then to Roosevelt, please launch what they